This is the third generation Briggs or Ferguson Altima toilet, made from 2000 up until circa 2010. This toilet in particular has a pretty poor reputation. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of things wrong with it. Well, let's take a look at them and see what they are. For starters, the overall design really isn't anything to write home about. It's pretty standard. There's the trapway passages, which I guess don't look the worst. But the design of this toilet is pretty standard. This one in particular is a comfort height model, but you can see how deep the bowl is, which is maybe not the greatest thing they've done. There's the trapway opening, which is a pretty standard circle. Not really much to write home about. And here are the rim jets. You can't really see. They're pretty different. And you can see some right there. But this thing is actually a side flusher, which is pretty interesting. Inside the tank, you can tell the handles replaced. They usually come with these pretty cheap white handles, so it's not shocking this one's replaced. This one comes with a quirky fill valve and a normal flapper. I think it can be a little bit different for which one you get, but tank ports are pretty standard, but they work fine. Here's a look at a flush. The flush itself is pretty interesting. Now, while this one seems to flush out just fine, most of these can have an issue of not flushing out properly, like siphoning out properly. And not only that, the pull and siphon are just very crappy. As you can see, it was kind of short, and sometimes things can get left behind. I've kind of experienced this myself, so I can attest to that. Besides the issue of the flush being kind of inconsiderate sometimes and being a little bit problematic on some, I think the biggest problem for most people is the performance. The opening itself is pretty small and standard, and honestly looks like a Cadet 2 at first. The trapways themselves don't look to be very bad per se, but it just doesn't work, especially with the problems that this toilet comes with, like the issues with the flush. While this thing does have a 2-inch trapway, these things have been known to clog fairly easily, which is not a great look. Let's also touch on ball runs. The ball run seems to look fine at first, especially on the sides here, as those are the main functioning jets. The back room is pretty often forgotten about and therefore can gather stains. Not the worst ball runs in the world, but not great either. Let's have a look up here too. Honestly, the front also looks very unimpactful too, which also isn't a great sign. And that is the third generation Briggs or Ferguson Altima toilet. Not a great design by any means. Honestly, I prefer the second generation design over this, without even questioning it. Honestly, this design did have potential, but the execution was just very poor. But let's grade it. The more I look at the overall design of this thing, the more I just don't like it. It just looks both cheap and generic to look at. Granted, the second generation has the same design later on, but that's still besides the point. I'm giving it a 4. The tank parts for the most part are fine, except the handle, which has a tendency to be pretty cheap. It's this cheap plastic handle and it often gets replaced fairly easily. But the older generations had this exact same problem. But besides that, the tank parts work perfectly fine and get a 6. The quality control is crap. There really isn't much to say. It's in fact the biggest problem with this toilet is the quality control. It just wasn't experimented enough with and should have been tested a lot more before it was released. This thing needs a lot of water to flush out, or so it seems. If not, these have a tendency to not siphon out at all. Sometimes they still don't even siphon. Thankfully, it seems to be a rare problem with these, but it's still something I experienced a couple times. Not only that, there's just other issues too, like some of the rim jobs not working properly and all the rest. It gets a free. The trapway seems fine at first until you take a close look at it. Between some of the turns in the trapway opening, this thing just doesn't seem to perform all that well, which is strange because it has a 2-inch trapway, but some things just don't work with this trapway as well as it should, especially considering all the other stuff wrong with this toilet. It gets a 4. The flush at first seems to be not too bad when it works properly. Like I mentioned earlier, this thing actually needs a lot of water to flush out sometimes, but even then, sometimes it can have issues not flushing out. Thankfully a rare problem, but I have experienced it a few times with these. It's not a good look when you need this much water just to flush out. It makes you wonder if this is even 1.6 at all. Because of the issues of the flush, I'm at most giving it a 5. The pull and siphon are just very short and kind of crap. It looks sufficient at first, but then you add in the problem that's just a bit shoddy, and not only that, sometimes it doesn't even siphon out. Some stuff can be left behind and it's not pleasant. I'm going to have to give it a 3. While I don't think it's the worst performing toilet in the world, it's still not a good performing toilet. Between the bins and the trapway opening, these can have a tendency to clog. While I haven't surprisingly clogged one of these, the performance could definitely be a lot better, so I'm giving it a 4. The ball runs also really isn't great. Some areas are covered fine, while front and back rims are barely covered at all, which is a bit ridiculous. Granted, it's far from the worst ball runs I've ever seen, but definitely could have been improved upon. It gets a 4. Before this particular toilet, the last time I've seen a Ferguson Briggs Altima was 3 years ago. That means these are getting pretty rare, and for obvious reasons. These just have a lot of problems and just don't really hold up that well, so it's not very surprising to see these going away so soon. The current survivability right now is looking like a 4. Now it's time to talk about the overall value. There was so much potential with this, but just the execution was just very bad. This thing has a lot of quality control issues, a lot of issues flushing, performance isn't great, the ball runs isn't great. There's just not a lot to like about this toilet. It looks interesting at first, but the more you put up with it, you think, wow, this is bad. It's a shame, honestly, because this thing did have potential, but just the execution was just not good at all. And because of that, I'm giving it a 3 in value. The final score of the third generation Briggs Altima is a 39 out of 100. Once again, this toilet had some potential and had some interesting ideals, but the execution was just very bad. This thing is just loaded with problems, and it's not surprising to see these becoming rare. There were so many problems with this toilet that Briggs just didn't fix it. Instead, for the next generation, decided to go the generic route. Way to go.